The grand ballroom was alive with light, music, and conversation. Crystal chandeliers hung high above the polished floor, casting soft reflections across tables filled with guests dressed in black tie elegance. Laughter mixed with the quiet clinking of glasses as executives, celebrities, and investors moved through the room, greeting one another and posing for photos. This wasn't just any event. It was one of those nights where every detail had been planned weeks in advance. The kind of gala where every name on the guest list had been checked, confirmed, and placed carefully at the right table. Near the entrance, a velvet rope separated the arrival hallway from the main ballroom. 2 security guards stood beside it, scanning invitations and quietly guiding guests inside. For the most part, the process had been smooth all evening, until one moment changed the rhythm of the entire room. A man in a dark suit walked calmly toward the entrance. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't trying to draw attention. His steps were steady, relaxed, almost casual compared to the energy of the gala around him. As he approached the velvet rope, one of the security guards stepped forward and lifted a hand. "Excuse me, sir," the guard said firmly. "May I see your invitation?" The man stopped. He looked at the guard, then briefly at the ballroom beyond the rope where guests continued moving between tables. Instead of reaching for a phone or a pass, he simply stood there. Calm, patient, silent. The guard glanced at the list in his hand again. "Sir," he repeated, a little louder this time, "this event is invitation only." The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but something about it made nearby guests start paying attention. A couple standing near the entrance slowed their conversation. Another guest waiting to enter paused mid-step. Phones began to lower. Eyes turned toward the doorway because the man security had just stopped. Looked unmistakably like Steven. And yet, there he stood, quietly being held at the entrance of one of the most exclusive galas of the night. Inside the ballroom, the music kept playing, but near the doors, something unusual was beginning to unfold. And within moments, more people started watching. For a moment, the guard studied the man standing in front of him. Events like this moved quickly, and security teams were trained to make decisions in seconds. Every guest arriving at the door had to be checked, no exceptions. The list in the guard's hand was long, and the pressure to keep everything running smoothly was constant. The man waiting at the rope stood calmly, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. He wasn't trying to step past the barrier. He wasn't raising his voice. He simply waited. The guard glanced down at the printed guest list again, scanning through the names one more time. Nothing. He looked back up. "Sir," he said, keeping his tone firm but controlled. "Without an invitation or credentials, I can't allow you inside." A couple walking toward the ballroom slowed their steps when they heard the exchange. One of them turned slightly, curious about what was happening at the entrance. The man being stopped didn't argue. He didn't pull out a phone to prove anything. He just nodded once. It was the kind of calm reaction that almost made the situation more noticeable. The guard misread the silence as confirmation of his decision. At events like this, confidence mattered. If security hesitated, things could spiral quickly. So he stood his ground. "If you're here for the public reception area," the guard added, gesturing toward the hallway, "that entrance is around the side of the building." Another guest entering behind them paused when she heard the direction being given. Now 3 or 4 people near the doorway were quietly watching. The man behind the rope glanced toward the ballroom again. From where he stood, he could see the glowing lights, the long tables, and the crowd gathered inside the event. Still no frustration, still no argument, just patience. But the longer the moment stretched, the more noticeable it became. 2 guests waiting near the check-in table exchanged a quiet whisper. Someone further back leaned slightly to get a better look, and that's when recognition started spreading through the hallway. Because the man security had just redirected looked exactly like Steven. One guest quietly murmured the name. Another guest pulled out their phone, not to record yet, but to look again, to make sure they weren't mistaken. The guard didn't notice the growing attention. Behind him, to him, this was still a routine situation. Someone had arrived without visible credentials, and his job was simply to enforce the rules. But what he didn't realize was that the hallway had gone almost completely quiet. Conversations had slowed. People were watching. And with every passing second, the simple decision at the door was turning into something the entire entrance area could feel. Not loud, not chaotic, just a moment stretching longer than anyone expected. A moment where everyone sensed that something unusual was about to happen next. At first, it was only a few people near the entrance who noticed. A couple standing beside the welcome table slowed their conversation and glanced toward the velvet rope. A man adjusting his tie while waiting to enter paused mid-movement. Even the event assistant scanning invitations looked up for a moment. Nothing dramatic had happened. No raised voices. No argument. Just a quiet pause between a security guard and a man waiting at the entrance. But sometimes, silence pulls more attention than noise. Inside the ballroom, the music continued to play, but the doorway had become its own small stage. Guests moving toward the hall began to slow down when they sensed something unusual. The guard, still standing firmly at the rope, checked the printed list again. He ran his finger down several rows of names. Then he shook his head slightly. "Sir," he said again, maintaining the same professional tone, "I'm sorry, but I don't see your name here." The man standing on the other side of the rope remained completely calm. No frustration, no attempt to push past the barrier. He simply looked toward the ballroom, then back toward the guard, almost as if he was waiting for the situation to resolve itself. A few more guests had gathered near the entrance now. Some were arriving for the gala. Others had already entered the ballroom but drifted back toward the doorway after noticing the small pause in activity. One woman whispered quietly to the person beside her is that she didn't finish the sentence. But the person next to her nodded slowly, because the man standing quietly outside the rope looked unmistakably like Steven. Another guest leaned slightly to the side to get a clearer view. Someone further back took out their phone, not yet recording, but clearly curious about what they were seeing. The guard still hadn't noticed the shift in the atmosphere behind him. To him, this was still routine. A guest had arrived without visible credentials. The rules were simple. No name on the list meant no entry, but the longer the moment lasted, the more attention it attracted. Inside the ballroom, a few people had turned toward the entrance after hearing the quiet murmurs near the hallway. A group standing near the bar stopped mid-conversation. Even one of the photographers near the stage lowered his camera and looked toward the doorway. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't confrontation. It was something stranger. A slow ripple of curiosity moving through the room. The man at the rope still hadn't raised his voice. In fact, his calm presence seemed to make the moment feel even more unusual, because most people in that situation would have tried to explain themselves by now. They would have insisted their name was on the list. They would have called someone inside. But he didn't do any of that. He simply stood there, relaxed, hands loosely at his sides, almost like he was observing the moment just as much as everyone else was. And by now, the number of people quietly watching had grown. Some guests pretended to adjust their jackets while glancing over. Others leaned slightly closer to hear the conversation. The guard finally looked up from the guest list again. He noticed the small crowd near the entrance for the first time, but he still didn't seem concerned. To him, everything was under control. The rope was still in place. The rules were still being followed. Yet the room had clearly changed. What had started as a routine check at the door had turned into a moment everyone nearby could feel. No one knew exactly what would happen next. But no one was walking away either. Because sometimes when a quiet moment stretches just a little too long, people instinctively stay to see how it ends. And standing there, watching the scene unfold, many guests were likely asking themselves the same thing. If you were standing there watching this unfold, what would you assume was happening? By now, the quiet tension near the entrance had spread further into the ballroom. Conversations that had filled the room only minutes earlier were beginning to soften. Guests who had been focused on networking and greetings were now glancing toward the hallway more often than toward each other. The music continued in the background, but it felt distant compared to the growing curiosity around the entrance. The security guard still stood confidently beside the velvet rope, one hand resting near the stand as he monitored the situation in front of him. Across from him, the man waiting calmly on the other side remained composed. He hadn't stepped forward. He hadn't raised his voice. He simply stood there watching the room in the same quiet way the room was beginning to watch him. A few guests near the doorway whispered quietly to each other. Some were now openly turning their bodies toward the entrance, instead of pretending not to notice. Recognition had spread through the hallway. Several people were certain they knew who the man was, and yet the situation hadn't changed. The rope was still in place. The guard was still holding his position. The man outside the rope still hadn't tried to explain anything. Then something shifted. At the far end of the hallway, one of the ballroom doors opened. A woman stepped out, walking quickly but with the calm confidence of someone used to moving through important rooms. She wore a sharp evening suit that stood out even in a place filled with formal attire. Her posture was upright, her expression focused, and the moment she appeared in the hallway, several nearby staff members straightened instinctively. She wasn't rushing, but she was clearly moving with purpose. A few guests noticed her immediately. 2 executives near the entrance exchanged a quick glance. They recognized her, because she wasn't just another guest attending the gala. She was the person responsible for hosting it, the CEO behind the entire event. The woman had spent weeks organizing the evening, coordinating with sponsors, speakers, and hundreds of attendees to make sure everything ran perfectly. And now she was walking directly toward the entrance where the quiet standoff had been unfolding. As she approached, her eyes moved across the small crowd gathered near the rope. Then, her attention settled on the security guard, and finally on the man standing calmly outside the barrier. For a brief moment, she stopped walking. Not out of confusion, more like recognition. Her expression changed almost instantly. The focused look she had carried through the hallway softened into something else, surprise mixed with understanding. Several guests standing nearby noticed the shift. One of them leaned toward another and whispered something under their breath. The guard, still unaware of the growing attention behind him, hadn't turned around yet. He continued facing the man outside the rope, holding his position like nothing unusual had happened. But the CEO had now reached the entrance. She slowed her steps as she approached the velvet rope. The quiet crowd parted slightly, giving her space to move forward. A few guests instinctively stepped back. Others leaned in closer, curious to see what she would do. The hallway had become completely silent. Even the faint sounds from the ballroom seemed to fade as people waited. The CEO looked briefly at the security guard. Then she turned her attention to the man who had been standing calmly outside the rope. For a second, neither of them spoke. But the moment carried a kind of recognition that several guests immediately noticed, because the man being stopped at the entrance was still Steven, and now the person hosting the entire gala was standing just a few feet away from him. The guard finally turned his head, noticing the CEO's presence beside him. He straightened quickly. But by then, the atmosphere in the hallway had already changed. Every guest near the entrance was watching closely, waiting to see how the person in charge would respond to the moment that had quietly captured the attention of the entire room. For a brief moment, the entire hallway stood still. The CEO had reached the velvet rope, standing just beside the security guard who had been managing the entrance all evening. Guests nearby had instinctively created space around her, forming a quiet half-circle that made the moment feel even more noticeable. The guard straightened immediately when he realized who was standing next to him. "Good evening, ma'am," he said quickly, his voice more formal now. "Everything is under control." The CEO gave a small nod, acknowledging him, but she didn't speak right away. Instead, her eyes shifted toward the man standing on the other side of the rope. The hallway was quiet enough now that even the soft music from the ballroom felt distant. Conversations had completely stopped. Guests who had gathered near the entrance were no longer pretending to look elsewhere. Everyone was watching, because the man waiting calmly outside the rope was still Steven. The guard, still confident in his earlier decision, glanced down at the list in his hand one more time. "I checked the guest list twice," he explained politely. "I don't see his name anywhere." His tone wasn't defensive. If anything, it sounded like someone calmly explaining a routine situation to a supervisor. He gestured lightly toward the hallway. I assumed he might be looking for the public reception area, so I directed him to the other entrance. The CEO listened without interrupting. Her expression remained neutral, giving nothing away. The guard continued speaking, trying to clarify the situation. "We've had a few guests arrive without credentials tonight," he added. "So I'm just following the protocol we were given." A few people in the small crowd exchanged quiet glances. From their perspective, the explanation sounded reasonable. Security at an event like this had to be careful. Still, the longer the silence lasted, the more noticeable it became. The CEO's attention returned to the man standing behind the rope. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. The man hadn't moved. His posture was the same, relaxed, patient, almost as if he had expected the situation to unfold exactly this way. He didn't interrupt the conversation. He didn't step forward. He simply waited. That calm presence seemed to make the moment even heavier, because by now, nearly everyone near the entrance understood what was happening. The guard was explaining his decision. The CEO was listening, and the man at the rope hadn't said a single word to defend himself. One guest near the doorway quietly leaned toward another and whispered something. Another guest lowered their phone slowly, focusing completely on the exchange. The hallway had become so still that even small movements felt noticeable. The CEO finally took a slow step forward, not toward the guard, toward the velvet rope. Her shoes made a soft sound against the marble floor as she moved closer to the barrier. The guard instinctively shifted slightly, giving her space. For a moment, she looked again at the man standing across from her. Then she glanced briefly at the rope itself, the symbol of the boundary that had created the entire situation. The crowd watching nearby seemed to hold its breath, because everyone could feel that the moment was about to change. The guard still believed he had done the right thing. The man behind the rope remained calm and silent, and the CEO now stood directly between them. 3 people, one quiet decision, and a room full of witnesses, waiting to see what would happen next. For a few seconds, no one moved. The CEO stood beside the velvet rope, the security guard slightly behind her, and the quiet crowd watching from every angle of the hallway. The air felt different now, heavier, like the entire moment had been building, towards something everyone could sense but no one had seen yet. The guard still held the printed guest list in his hand. From his point of view, he had simply followed instructions. The rules had been clear from the beginning of the night. Check the names, confirm the invitations, and keep the entrance secure. Nothing about that had changed, but the CEO's attention was still fixed on the man waiting calmly outside the rope. The man who hadn't raised his voice. The man who hadn't argued. The man who had simply stood there, patient and silent while the situation unfolded. That man was Seagal. Several guests nearby leaned slightly closer, sensing that the moment everyone had been waiting for was about to happen. The CEO finally spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, and clear enough for the people nearest to hear. "It's all right," she said. The guard blinked slightly, unsure whether she was addressing him or the situation itself. She took one small step forward. Then she reached out and gently lifted the velvet rope aside. The motion was simple, quiet, but the effect on the hallway was immediate. A few guests exchanged surprised looks. Someone near the doorway let out a quiet breath they hadn't realized they were holding. The CEO looked directly at the man outside the rope. A small, respectful smile appeared on her face. "Mr. Seagal," she said, her tone warm, but composed. "We've been expecting you." For the first time since the moment had started, the silence broke. Soft murmurs moved through the small crowd gathered near the entrance. The guard's posture changed instantly. He looked down at the guest list again, flipping one page as if a name might suddenly appear that he had missed earlier. But the CEO's words had already clarified everything. The man standing outside the rope gave a small nod. Still calm, still composed. There was no frustration in his expression. If anything, he seemed almost amused by the situation that had quietly unfolded. The CEO stepped fully aside, holding the rope open so he could pass. "Please," she said. "Welcome." As Seagal stepped forward and entered the hallway, several guests instinctively moved out of the way. The security guard looked momentarily frozen, not embarrassed exactly, but clearly realizing that the situation had been more complicated than it first appeared. The CEO turned toward him briefly. Her tone remained calm and professional. "You were doing your job," she said quietly. It wasn't a reprimand. It sounded more like reassurance, because technically, the guard had followed the instructions he had been given. But there had been one detail missing from the printed list, and it had just walked through the door. As Seagal entered the ballroom, the quiet murmurs spread further into the room. People, who had been standing near the entrance, began turning back toward the tables and stage. Word moved quickly through the crowd. Some guests looked toward the doorway with renewed curiosity. Others simply smiled, realizing they had just witnessed a small moment that no one had expected when the evening began. The CEO walked beside Seagal for a few steps, guiding him toward the main area of the event. The velvet rope slowly fell back into place behind them. And just like that, the tension that had filled the hallway began to fade. But the story of what had happened at the entrance was already moving through the room. Because sometimes the most memorable moments at an event aren't the ones planned on the schedule. Sometimes they happen quietly at the door. A simple misunderstanding, a moment of patience, and a reveal that turns a routine situation into something no one there will forget. As Steven stepped past the velvet rope and into the ballroom, the quiet tension that had filled the hallway slowly began to dissolve. But the moment wasn't over yet, because many of the guests near the entrance were still watching the CEO. They had seen her lift the rope. They had heard her calmly welcome him inside. But what she did next was what truly captured everyone's attention. Instead of immediately turning back to the event or walking away as if nothing had happened, the CEO paused for a moment near the doorway. She turned slightly toward the security guard. The guard still held the guest list in his hands, standing straighter now, clearly aware that dozens of eyes had just witnessed the situation unfold. For a brief second, it looked like he might begin apologizing. But before he could speak, the CEO raised her hand gently, not to silence him, more like a small signal that there was no need for panic. Her expression remained calm and composed. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do," she said. Her voice was steady, not loud, but clear enough for the nearby guests and staff to hear. The guard blinked in surprise. Most people in his position might have expected criticism or frustration. After all, an important guest had just been stopped at the entrance of the event. But the CEO didn't sound upset at all. If anything, her tone carried a kind of quiet respect. "You followed the instructions," she continued. "That's what good security does." Several guests standing nearby exchanged quick glances. It wasn't the reaction they had expected. In situations like this, people often look for someone to blame, but the CEO didn't appear interested in assigning fault. Instead, she briefly glanced toward the ballroom where Seagal had just entered. Then she looked back at the guard. "There was simply one detail missing from the list tonight," she added. The guard slowly nodded, understanding what she meant. The moment that could have turned awkward had instead been handled calmly, and because of that, the situation never escalated. A few guests nearby began quietly returning to their conversations. The tension that had pulled everyone toward the entrance started fading as the evening's normal rhythm returned. The CEO gave the guard a final nod. "Keep doing exactly what you're doing," she said. That's how events like this stay secure. Relief crossed the guard's face. He straightened slightly and returned the nod, clearly grateful that the situation had been handled with professionalism instead of pressure. Meanwhile, inside the ballroom, Steven had already begun greeting a few guests who recognized him. The quiet story of what had just happened at the entrance was spreading through the room, carried by whispers and curious glances. Some guests laughed softly about the unexpected moment. Others shook their heads in disbelief. But many of them seemed impressed by how calmly the CEO had handled it. Because in a room filled with powerful people, expensive suits, and carefully planned schedules, the most memorable moment of the night had happened in a quiet hallway. A moment that could have turned tense, but instead turned into something far more interesting. And as the music continued and conversations slowly picked back up around the ballroom, one thought seemed to linger in the minds of the people who had witnessed it all. Do you think the guard made the right decision by following the rules, even without knowing who the guest was? As Steven moved further into the ballroom, the quiet story of what had just happened at the entrance began spreading through the room like a ripple. At first, it moved through the guests who had witnessed the moment directly. A small group near the doorway began explaining the situation to others standing nearby. He was stopped at the rope, one guest whispered. Security didn't recognize him. Another guest shook their head slightly, half amused. And then the CEO came out and lifted the rope herself. Within seconds, the story started traveling table to table. People leaned closer to hear the details. Some reacted with surprise. Others smiled, clearly entertained by the unexpected moment that had unfolded at what was supposed to be a perfectly organized gala. Near the center of the ballroom, a few executives paused their conversation as someone quietly filled them in on what had happened. One man laughed softly. "Only at an event like this," he said. Across the room, a group of guests standing near the stage turned toward the entrance to see if they could spot Seagal among the crowd. The energy of the room had shifted slightly, not in a chaotic way, more like a shared moment that people were processing together. Because the story had everything people remembered: a security guard doing his job, a well-known guest being stopped at the door, and a calm decision from the CEO that turned the moment around. Meanwhile, Steven continued moving through the ballroom with the same calm presence he had shown outside the rope. Several guests greeted him politely as he passed. Some offered quick handshakes. Others simply nodded in recognition. There was no sign that the situation at the entrance had bothered him at all. If anything, he seemed completely relaxed. Near the bar area, two guests were quietly discussing what they had heard. "I guess security was just following the rules," one of them said. The other nodded thoughtfully. "Honestly, that's probably what they're supposed to do." Nearby, a photographer who had been setting up earlier now turned slightly, hoping to capture a few photos as Seagal moved through the crowd. At another table, someone retold the moment with small gestures, mimicking the way the velvet rope had been lifted. The listeners reacted with a mix of surprise and quiet laughter. Moments like this didn't usually appear in the official program of a formal gala, but they often became the stories people remembered later, stories that traveled beyond the ballroom. Stories people shared the next day when someone asked how the event went, and in this case, the story had a calm ending. No confrontation, no embarrassment, just a simple misunderstanding that had turned into one of the most talked about moments of the night. Across the room, the CEO had already returned to greeting guests and coordinating with the event staff. The security guard at the entrance had resumed checking invitations as if nothing unusual had happened. The velvet rope stood exactly where it had been before. The music continued. Conversations picked up again. But the atmosphere of the room now carried a subtle sense of curiosity, the kind that follows a moment people know they won't forget. And as guests continued sharing the story in small circles across the ballroom, one question quietly lingered in many of their minds. If you had been the CEO in that moment, would you have handled the situation the same way? By the end of the night, the gala had settled back into its usual rhythm. The chandeliers sparkled, the music played softly, and guests mingled over drinks and hors d'oeuvres. But one story refused to fade: the incident at the entrance. Whispers of Steven being stopped by security traveled from one table to the next. Some guests had witnessed it firsthand, while others had only heard the story from friends who had been there. Either way, everyone seemed captivated by how the situation had unfolded. People discussed the event with a mixture of amusement and curiosity. One guest remarked, "Can you believe security didn't even recognize him?" Another responded, "I think it was a simple oversight. Anyone could have done the same." Even the most high-profile attendees, normally reserved in their conversations, couldn't resist commenting. "The CEO stepping in like that, it changed everything," said a well-known executive quietly to a neighbor. It wasn't just about Seagal being stopped. It was about how someone in a position of authority responded calmly and decisively. That choice transformed what could have been an awkward or embarrassing moment into a story that everyone remembered fondly. Guests started analyzing every detail: the timing, the gestures, the expression on the CEO's face. Some laughed at the idea of a security misunderstanding at such a formal event. Others nodded in approval at how gracefully it was handled. One thing was clear: the moment had shifted the focus from the mistake itself to the reaction of those in charge. As the night wound down, small groups formed around the tables, recounting the story in their own words. Each retelling added a new layer of intrigue or humor, but all emphasized the same point: the CEO's action had been unexpected and effective. In fact, the story became almost legendary for the evening. Social media buzzed later with posts from attendees sharing their perspective, tagging the gala, and debating the incident. Everyone seemed to agree that while mistakes happen, the response of those in power can redefine the narrative entirely. The lesson lingered as the guests prepared to leave. Conversations weren't just about the glitz of the gala or the famous attendees. They centered on the moment of choice, the decision that had changed everything in seconds. And as people finally stepped out into the night, one question remained on many minds, quietly shaping how they would tell the story to others. Which matters more, the mistake or the response of those in power?